everyone, and welcome to this evening's episode of Pi Gotham TV. My name is Cameron Riddell, and I will be your host, exploring the topic, would Edward Tufte like Matplotlib? Now, data visualization and Matplotlib are two of my favorite topics ever to talk about, and so why don't we go ahead and dive into the code that I've prepared to share with you all to prove to you that I do think that Edward Tufte would like Matplotlib. You might not know too much about Edward Tufte, and so I'll share with you that Edward Tufte is a world-renowned data visualization pioneer and information design expert. He's not just an author, but a trailblazer who revolutionized how we communicate complex information. He has a lot of unique, novel ideas about how we communicate visually. And so his work does not just relate to creating charts on a graph, but also how do you design PowerPoints? How do you design Excel sheets that are effective to use and effective to navigate through? And so Tufte's ideas transcend that of just academic ideas, influencing industries from journalism to business, making data more accessible, meaningful, and of course, beautiful. Now, Edward Tufte has a lot of claims to fame when it comes to his ideas, but I think some of his most convincing and best ideas are that of graphical integrity. So whenever you're making a chart, it should absolutely reflect the underlying data. And in order to preserve that, you need to maintain a high, what's called a data to ink ratio. And a data to ink ratio, all that's saying is of all of the ink that you put onto a given data visualization, well, it should be used mostly to report the data that's there, not to really accent or provide aesthetic beauty to your data, or in the worst case, distracting sidebars. And so, the last thing that I love from Edward Tufte is minimalism in data visualization. And so this really relates to the above point, but it's all about saying, I don't want all of the fancy bar charts. If you're reporting something on cities, don't turn your bars into towers. Keep it simple, keep it basic, because when you start including all of these aesthetic design decisions, that distracts your audience away from the data itself, and you might actually misconstrue the point that you were trying to make in the first place. And so, when we talk about would Edward Tufte like Matplotlib, I would say yes. And the reason is this. Edward Tufte usually does hand-drawn graphical elements, or in the past has done hand-drawn graphical elements, and his charts are extremely, extremely high touch, meaning there's a lot of attention to detail, there's often a good amount of data, and every single decision that has been made of graphical elements to include on that chart has been thoroughly thought through and very carefully placed. And Matplotlib gives you that flexibility to take that much care into your chart. You can put an annotation absolutely anywhere you want it. You can put given shapes absolutely anywhere you want them. And so, what is Matplotlib really? Well, I would say that Matplotlib is more than just a graphical or a data visualization tool. Matplotlib is a drawing tool, and I can prove it to you. If I were to simply draw a circle and include it in the middle of my chart, well, you might say, Cameron, all you've done is add a circle. Any data visualization toolkit should be able to do this. Well, all of a sudden, if I just add a few more rectangles, I have an entire stick figure. And I'm willing to bet that there's not a lot of data visualization toolkits out there that can very easily represent a stick figure because of the abstractions that Matplotlib includes. It's very low level. Here you saw me just adding shapes onto a figure. And so in Matplotlib, we always liken our figure sort of to the sheet of paper, the thing that we're drawing on. And what's very useful to draw will be our axes. So in Matplotlib, we have the connotation of our figure and our axes. And the whole idea here is that our axes are the things that we are going to be drawing on. And the axes are all about supporting our data and adding our data to our chart. Instead of just creating something like a stick figure, we can actually create data that we're charting onto our plot. Here you can see a very basic layout. All I have is a single set of axes, and axes with an E here means a y-axis and an x-axis. And so, can we take some of Tufte's ideas and implement them in Matplotlib? Now, Tufte has a lot of different ideas to include. One of my favorites is the range frame. Here in the previous rendition, I'll increase this font size so you can see it a little bit more. But here in this set of axes, X and Y axes, we actually have a touch. We have what's called a corner here in our chart. And now in the bottom left, you actually see the zeros of both my X and Y axis. They're actually touching. And what this tends to indicate is that no data exists to the left or below, to the left of the x-axis or below the y-axis. By having these parts of my frame touch, I'm actually hinting at this could be a hard bound for how much data therein lies. And now you can think, if my y-axis didn't start at 0, maybe my y-axis started at 100, you can think that having 0 and 100 touch doesn't make a lot of sense conceptually. And so Tufte included what's called, what he refers to as the range frame. And of course we can make this in Matplotlib. And so let's go ahead, we'll create our range frame so that you can see it. First up, we have our default frame. In our default frame, I've removed the top and the right-hand bars here just to clean things up a little bit. But you can see in my bottom left-hand side, my spines are actually touching, thus indicating that there might not be any more data, or I might not expect any more data beyond those 2 points. And of course, if I had to experience a new minimum or maximum on my y-axis, I would have to extend that. Now, if I take my range frame and I display that for you, you can see the ever slight difference. In the range frame, we stop drawing our spines whenever we draw our final tick. And so now on my X and Y axis, instead of having my spines touch into a corner, you can see that this idea better connotates that my data might actually span down to 0, might span to negative infinity, and that these axes are just here just to label or provide guidance for the data itself instead of trying to assert something about the data itself. Now, what I like about the range axes, you can actually include just a little bit more detail. And Tufte would often do this because why not have our axes actually describe the data? Why can't they be another graphical element in themselves? And so I can actually chart here or annotate the true minimum and maximum values of my chart. I can back those away from the actual ticks just a little bit more. And you can see that I've now captured the full range of my data. I've annotated it where my minimums and maximums occur, what values those occur at. And of course, it's going to be approximation because we're only going down to a single decimal point. But you can see the idea here of how the range frame works, how it's giving me a little bit more information about my actual data, unlike my left hand, my default frame, and why Tufte might want this. We've actually done some erasing in order to reduce the amount of visual elements on our chart, thus eliminating things like chart junk, or even more minimalistic approach, I should say here. But you can see this idea here in Edward Tufte's range frame, and we can very easily do this. Talking about the mechanics of how we do this, well, we first need to understand a couple of things about Matplotlib. The first thing is that we actually have access to what are called a set of view limits and a set of data limits. Now, they are intertwined, meaning my data limits are just going to be the bounds of my data. It's going to be my minimum x, minimum y, maximum y. But then, in order to draw an effective chart, we often increase our bounds away from those maximums, and you can see this on my left-hand side. Why doesn't my left spine touch against my left minimum axis point? And the reason for that is because we've calculated a different limit, our view limit. What is the window of the thing that we are looking into? Well, it turns out we can use those values, which are actually attached to the axes, so very readily accessible. And then we can actually just set the bounds on our spines. Now, the spines are the little lines that are going around my frame in a box. So on the default frame, it's this vertical line on my left-hand side or the horizontal line across the bottom. And I can actually set the bounds of those in data space, meaning I can actually cut them off at a given value. So it just takes a little bit of code to figure out what's the current minimum value on my y-axis on my actual spine. So these are my Y ticks here. And then you just cross tabulate that against, right, your actual data, and you have your range frame. You just need to update your X and Y bounds on that spine. Then we can actually add in our very own label. And so we've done this to include our minimum and maximum values, including our data limits. Well, what's another element that we can take from Edward Tufte, or we can include from Edward Tufte? Well, another thing or another idea of Edward Tufte's that we can implement are small multiples. This is one of my favorite plotting, I don't want to say tricks, but guidances. Oftentimes, I've seen a lot of charts that look like this. They are line charts. They are showing some type of nominal or categorical data. And I wouldn't even say that these are nominal. These are most certainly ordinal because there is an ordering to them, but that's not appropriately captured by the encoding mechanism that we've chosen to use, here in this case, categorical colors. But you can see, if I am trying to represent the number of customers here on my y-axis that maybe my restaurant receives each year, if I chart all of this data onto a single chart, it becomes slightly overwhelming. One of the tricks that I can do, instead of using a categorical or true categorical color map, I can sample from a sequential color map because there is an orderedness to my years here, going from 2000 to 2010. And if you look very closely, you can see that there's a ever slightly shifting, an upward shifting of my color palette from the very bottom of my axes to the very top. And if you think about that just for a moment, you would understand that, oh, this is showing that as my years progress, as my years increase, I'm also seeing an increase in the daily number of customers. But how else could we represent this data? This seems, in one word, a little overplotted to me. Now, there are definitely charts taking use of this idea. One thing that I might do is change up the color just a little bit and start highlighting maybe the minimum maximum years and say, oh, 2000 was the lowest year and 2010 was the highest year. But something that we can do, and quite effectively, might I add, is actually plot each of these years on a different set of axes. And now, when we do this, instead of using a single axis, you can actually see that we have a very different squiggly line here representing our daily average number of customers. But what we've done by putting our years and sorting them numerically from 2000 to 2010, you can start to intonate or start to see that, oh, that squiggly line is moving up ever so slightly. Now, we can of course include a couple of visual tricks in order to ease that comparison on the eyes. If I really want to showcase that this average is actually increasing, well, I can include two supplemental pieces of information here. I actually might want to include a horizontal bar. And what this horizontal bar is doing, it's representing the average for that year. If I'm asserting something about the daily average or the average moving up year from year, I should probably draw attention to that. And better yet, I can even make it the same color as the phrase average in my title. Now, if there was ambiguity as to whether this average was increasing or not, I think we can lay that ambiguity to rest because we can very clearly see the Y level on my horizontal red line here is increasing year to year to year. And so you can very clearly see this increase from 2000 all the way up to 2010. One final thing that I always love doing with small multiples, especially with line data, is actually including all of the data on every single chart. Now, I'll just use color here to represent, or to use gray, which is often used to represent a background color. But now I've charted all of the same exact data onto every single one of these plots, and you can even see which one you're currently looking at that's highlighted in blue, and then the average of that is highlighted in red. Now, if you were doubtful as to whether or not there was an increase in the daily average number of customers at my restaurant, well, I don't think you have a foot to stand on anymore. We have clearly visually communicated this point that my restaurant is getting more and more customers as time progresses. And so that was the whole idea of small multiples, is using multiple charts, facilitating the comparison from one to the next very easily. And this helps us reduce overplotting our data or overrepresenting our data. Now, we can also take Tufte's ideas on eliminating chart junk. Specifically, we will focus here on tick density. Now, the ticks, in any given chart, the ticks are the things that are on that X and Y axis, and just by default, Matplotlib uses what's called an auto locator. And this means that it takes the minimum and maximum of your data, it finds some nice evenly spaced ticks or locations to annotate that data or to create these tick markers, as they're called, and then it will chart them for you. And here you can see I have my ticks ranging from 0 to almost 2 pi for my single period of my sine and cosine waves here. But we also have access to doing this, say, manually. And if I want to do something silly like plot 0, 0.5, and 2 pi, well, I am free to do that because Matplotlib gives me the flexibility to do that. You can see I have very careful control. If I need to do something very specific, I can always drop down to manually supplying my ticks. Now, in an automation sense, which is often the area that we use charts, especially programmatic charts generated by Matplotlib, we don't always want to be supplying our ticks manually. And so we have multiple other approaches, including completely custom approaches that we can use for Matplotlib. Specifically, we can use our linear, our max n, or our multiple locator, and you can see what these are all about. The linear locator will actually take my view limits, which are negative 0.1 and 2.1 pi, and it will actually create, however many ticks I want between those endpoints, of course, including the endpoints. So I said, give me 5 ticks from the view limits of my chart. Then for the max n locator, we find nice tick locations with no more than the number of bins that I supplied plus 1. And so here this result looks very similar to the auto locator, but it's not exactly the same because we have a less number of ticks because I only told Matplotlib to give me 5 of them back. Now my favorite is the multiple locator here at the bottom. I can say, give me a tick at every unit of 1/2 of a pi, and Matplotlib will do that. And so here I have very nice control over my ticks, and of course the multiple locator actually gives you very fine-grained control over your tick density, because if I wanted to do something, say, overly dense, I could say give me a tick every 0.1 units of pi, and this is a representation of what a too much of a density on your ticks are. And so it's always good to very carefully choose that value. Do I use 0.1 pi? Do I use 0.5 pi? Do I just use pi as a unit in itself? Well, I think that's a little sparse. It's not going to give me a good relationship between the x-axis and my underlying data, or my above-lying data, I should say. And so Matplotlib gives us very fine-grained control over our tick density, allowing us to reduce the amount of visual noise that somebody has to look at whenever they're looking at our charts. This allows us to focus more so on the data and less so on the supporting elements. We can also inline our legends. This is one of my favorite things to do in Matplotlib, and I think this is becoming a very common graphical trick, especially for the past decade or so. And you see this a lot of time in data visualization journalism, or journalism, where the whole idea is to show charts of varying degrees. And so our default chart here, now we're looking at temperature data taken at noon from various cities across these United States. But what you can see here is I need to do a lot of glancing in order to make sense of this. I need to glance down at my legend, take note that Los Angeles is the blue color, glance back up and see, okay, where is Los Angeles? Okay, that's the blue one. Glance back down, see the orange one. Okay, the orange one was right next to the blue one, and I need to keep doing this process of going back and forth and back and forth. We can actually reduce this strain on our audience. We can take our legend, and at the very least, we can put it off to the right-hand side of our chart. This at least gets our legend a little bit close to the line, so although I still need to do glance back and forth, I don't need to glance as far of a distance, right? In perception research, we call these saccades, and so I don't need to move my eyes a very large distance in order to complete the lines, or in order for the lines to touch their labels. But what you can see here is that, well, we could do better. These labels could actually be right next to the lines, and they don't even need to be in their own box inside of their own legend here. And so, if we completely remove that legend, and instead we opt to annotate our data using Matplotlib's tools, Well, we can do away with our legend totally, and we can just drop our labels right next to each of the lines that they represent, and we can even color those labels in the same color for the city that they represent, thus clearing up any ambiguity as to which label corresponds to which line. And now you can very, very easily see here that I've labeled my data without using a legend at all. And oftentimes we do want to be removing legends because they often are a little bit confusing to look at. You have to do a lot of glancing and a lot of understanding. If we can simplify any single perception on our audience, that will make our chart altogether better as a whole. And we've even removed a visual element completely from this chart, so it's less to look at, less to comprehend, and therefore our message becomes that much stronger. Now, we also have very fine-grained control over our chart junk, and specifically we'll be talking about a grid overlay. And so if I were to take this bar chart, which is just a count chart, right? And here I'm using the very popular penguins data set. But here you can see I'm just doing a simple count of the number of penguins by species. And now one of Tufte's ideas is that, well, why don't we just go ahead and include a grid? It might make things easier to reason about, a little bit easier for our audience to understand, because we want them to actually be counting these things. And so I'll go ahead, I'm going to add a grid on top of this chart. But at the same time that a grid might help, it might also hurt. You can very easily see, okay, most of the way up this chart or halfway up this chart is the value 80. And you have a nice gray line here depicting that. But at the same time that this makes comparison just a little bit easier, I would say that it makes comparison a little bit harder because it's extremely distracting. And this is the idea of chart junk, or eliminating chart junk, that we want to take from Tufte. And so Tufte was always a fan, or has always been a fan of, instead of using an actual grid or an apparent grid, we can simply use a grid that's the same color as our background color, so in this case white. But what you can see here is that there is no more real grid that's intrusive on my vision, and instead we've added a grid that you can only see on the data themselves. And so now, in addition to being able to measure from 0 all the way to the top of the bar and do a length comparison, I can also compare these bars by performing a count comparison. So I can just count the number of chunks that are apparent within each grid. Now, we can also do other things. We can even remove, right, the ticks. And so there were little dashes here just before and after each number. That's completely unnecessary, especially now that we have a grid indicating, right, what number corresponds to what Y value. The very final thing that we could do is remove all of those spines. That's the whole box around the plot. This plot simply does not need a square around it. Most plots actually don't need a square around it. And we can do away with that completely and just let the data stand on their own. Now, something else that we can do, in addition to simply letting our y-axis depict our data, we can actually just annotate our data. So I'll take that bar chart and I'll flip it on its side. And now, instead of using an axis to say, oh, this bar represents this much, I can just inline or label that data directly. And Matplotlib gives us the flexibility. Do I want to label it to the right with the text in a dark color or a contrasting color to the background? Or do I actually want to label it within my bar and use another contrasting color to get that point across? Matplotlib gives you the flexibility to annotate your data however you see fit, as flexible as you want. The last thing that we can go ahead and do, we can actually completely remove the bottom axis on our x-axis. Because these data have been labeled and they are all aligned to that axis, I actually don't need it for a reference. I can simply report these numbers inlined in these bars, and everyone will understand the same message that I'm trying to communicate, right? I have 152 of my first species, 124 of my next, and 68 of my third. Now, how can we supplant minimalism in other charts? We've talked a little bit about some line charts and some bar charts, but one of my favorite chart types that Tufte has is the box plot. And now this is a very traditional box and whisker chart that I've shown here on the left-hand side. We use the range here, and so for those of you who need a quick crash course in box plots, the whiskers here are often used to represent, right, some more extra amount of data. Oftentimes they are calculated as either the most extreme data point or 1.5 times what's called your interquartile range. That's the range from the 25th percentile up to the 75th percentile, multiplied by 1.5. And then you just take whichever value is closer to the median to represent your whisker. And then if you do have a point that falls beyond the whisker, often you use dots or some type of marker to connotate that this falls outside, right, our 1.5, our kind of confidence interval here for our box plot. But the box plot is used to represent, right, the 25th percentile here on the bottom, the median here in orange, and then the 75th percentile on the top. Now, taking some of Tufte's visual design practices of minimalism, we can greatly reduce what's shown in this chart and still convey the same ideas. Tufte's box and whisker style or a point and line plot are often used to communicate these very same metrics. My whiskers, or the tails of my whiskers, go to the extremes of each of these lines, either a high or low extreme, and then our inner quartiles, the 25th and 75th, are represented by the innermost portions of each of these lines, and then of course the dot in the middle is used to represent the mean. Now these communicate the exact same statistics and the exact same data, but the only difference here is that we are using way less ink on the right hand side to represent these data, and in Tufte's spirit of having or weighing a lot of importance on data to ink ratio, we're doing a much better job in terms of that. Now, as I said, Tufte has been known to create some extremely high quality graphics, and I think the best test that we can do is take one of Tufte's graphics. This was the New York City's weather in 2003. Tufte actually did this a few decades prior, and the chart looked slightly different, but Tufte redid this chart in 2003 for the weather in 2003. But effectively what's happening is each of these bars here in the center, the red bars, is the actual observed data, so the actual highs, daily highs, and daily lows of New York's weather. We then have a dark background representing, right, the normal range or the average across all of the years of data that he had, and then the lighter background color is used to represent the extreme values that we saw, so record highs and record lows. Now the thing that I love about this chart is there's no real legend, but there is a key. And this key is just one portion of the chart that is extremely highly detailed. Now on the lower hand portion of this chart, we have extremely annotated data, meaning that we have all of our precipitation data here on the bottom, and then Tufte takes the time to very nicely annotate or label each of these data points whenever there is, say, a record rainfall or a record snowfall or the 11th snowiest April. Can we do this in Matplotlib though? Well, it turns out it takes a little bit of code and searching for the right data set, but it turns out that we in fact can do this in Matplotlib, and this is my recreation of Edward Tufte's New York City's weather in 2003, completely done in Matplotlib. Now all of the graphical elements here are the same. My data set was slightly different, so some of the annotations, some of the record highs are just slightly different because we had a difference in data source, but you can see that using Matplotlib, I was very readily able to recreate his visualization. Now, would Edward Tufte like Matplotlib? Absolutely. I would say that if I can take one of his very highly technical charts and recreate it using this tool, I would say it's a tool that is worth exploring. You can create such very high impactful charts using Matplotlib. And so I would say that Tufte would like Matplotlib. And I wanted to thank you all for attending this episode of PyGotham TV. I've had a blast talking about Matplotlib, talking about visual design and how we can improve it using charting tools like Matplotlib, and of course, incorporating as many Tufte's elements into our visualizations to make sure that we have very clean and clear communicative charts. Thank you all, and I hope to see you all at a future episode of PyGotham TV.